Good afternoon. Welcome to the first in a series of webcasts sponsored by the Center for International Trade and Transportation. That's a division of the College of Continuing and Professional Education at California State University, Long Beach. I'm Matt Kaplan. It's my great pleasure to moderate this series that we've titled Cargo and Jobs, Still Ours to Lose? Now that title is not entirely new. We've borrowed it from our own big point-counterpoint event that we held last October here at Cal State Long Beach. That forum was attended by nearly 1,000 goods movement professionals, and it looked at the imminent expansion of the Panama Canal, and specifically at the challenges that expansion may present to those of us who call the West Coast home. We discovered at the end of the evening that there was much more to learn and discuss, so this new series was born. In this first program, we want to explore how shippers decide which ports their cargo should enter, and how those decisions may be affected in a world that is still developing at breakneck speed. Now, this is kind of an experiment, and you're helping us to conduct it. We need you to tell us what we get right, and also what we may not get so right, and whether you'd like to hear more, maybe beyond this initial series of 3 programs. A lot of great people have jumped into this with us, including our special guest today, the Chairman and CEO of MIQ Logistics, Joey Carnes. We'll be meeting him in just a few minutes. We especially want to thank our sponsors for taking a chance on this live presentation. 3 of them are among the organizations that have the most to win or lose in this time of decision and change. All are treasured and generous friends of Cal State Long Beach and the Center for International Trade and Transportation, or CITT. We've always been able to count on the Port of Los Angeles, the Port of Long Beach, and the International Longshore and Warehouse Union. This series is no exception, and we are very grateful for their support. Just one more thank you, and that goes to the MetTrans Transportation Center, a federally funded university transportation center that is a partnership between the University of Southern California and California State University, Long Beach, and it is headed by our good friend, Jen Giuliano. Let's begin by going back to that big event last October, the Point-Counterpoint event. Dr. Thomas O'Brien had everything to do with its success. He is here to help us frame today's discussion. Tom is the Center for International Trade and Transportation's Director of Research and the Associate Director of Long Beach Programs for MetTrans. Tom and I are also heard on the CITT's webcast, or podcast, that we have ever so cleverly named ContainerCast. Right. You can catch that on the CITT website, and we hope you will take a look and a listen to that. Tom, welcome, first of all.
It's good to be here, Matt.
Listen, you didn't just help plan the October Point-Counterpoint. You were the moderator of that program, had a lot of responsibility for making it all happen. Why did you and your colleagues at the center and other advisors decide that the Panama Canal was the right topic for last year?
Well, it was certainly a hot-button issue, and we were at a point where we were looking for a new opportunity to share information with the campus community, with the community at large. We were transitioning out of our signature event, which was our town hall meeting, which had been very successful for 10 years. But we began that at a time when there weren't a lot of forums discussing trade and goods movement related issues. We were looking for a new approach, something that would allow us to look at an important issue to the goods movement industry from a different angle or different angles, and we decided that a point-counterpoint approach might do it. Not that we were looking for winners and losers to identify winners and losers, but where we could explore issues, more complex issues in an in-depth manner. And if you go to the East Coast, if you take part in forums, the opening and the expansion of the expanded Panama Canal was clearly dividing people. It seemed that people were arguing that the East Coast was going to win, others saying that, hold your horses, it's a little bit more complex than that the West Coast is well positioned. And we have a lot at stake here on what the outcomes are. And we thought we were in a good position to explore that further.
What kinds of findings came out of that? Any conclusions?
Some conclusions. I think as we're going to talk about today, there was a lot that wasn't resolved. But there was some general consensus around the fact that a number of factors would decide who the winners and losers are, ultimately. I think we could say speed, time to market, transit time, and reliability were three things that you heard over and over throughout the course of the evening from the representatives who were on the panel. The other thing that we heard was that the people who were going to be in a good position to help make those decisions about which ports to use were going to be not only ocean carriers, but shippers and their agents. And there was a general agreement that that you needed to bring those people into the discussion if we were going to better understand who the winners and losers were going to be. They were the people that, our third question was who wins, who loses, who decides. And there was consensus around that fact as well.
Obviously, the conversation wasn't completed that evening. I mean, that's why we're here today. What are you hoping personally that we'll be able to accomplish with this series?
I think it's important to get at some of the nuances of the debate. I don't think it's fair to say that in 2014 or 2015, when the expansion is completed, is going to settle the case. The notion of competitiveness, questions of competitiveness, don't end then. Goods movement is a very dynamic industry. And the fact that people are making decisions now in response to changing trade lanes, the price of fuel, all of that, that's still going to be the case even after the canal opens. And what I hope that we're going to get a better understanding of what some of the factors are, what questions we need to ask now and moving forward so that we can better understand what, in Southern California, what we as a region need to do to remain competitive.
It's so easy to frame this as an East Coast versus West Coast thing, but is it really a little bit more subtle than that?
Well, it's a lot more subtle than that. I mean, first of all, it's not just East and West, it's East, West, and Gulf, and ports around the world. There's not just one canal at play, there's also, Suez at play. That's part of the equation as well. And the canal is just one option, one alternative. And I think that what we want to get at today, hopefully, is to begin to explore what those factors are going to be that go beyond just the canal, but that will help us decide what makes a region competitiveness, and what we need to do not only from an infrastructure standpoint, but from a regulatory standpoint. That will put us in the best position to succeed.
Just one other question. You gave me a lot of great material as background for the discussion today, and the one thing was this terrific little article called Pricing Toward Panama that was in the April 18 edition of the Journal of Commerce. And in it, Bill Mongeluzzo, I hope I have it right. It's not how my wife would pronounce it, but he actually came up with several conclusions, or at least observations. One was that some decisions are being made now, very important decisions, based on imperfect and incomplete information. And I want to know what you think about that. But he also says that the commercial policies of the Panamanian government are going to play a very important role in this.
Right. Yeah, I think the point from Bill's article was that a lot is going to be determined by pricing strategies from the Canal Authority itself. The Canal Authority has options on whether it wants to just charge fees that are going to allow them to retire the debt.
$5 billion
$5 billion project, or whether they want to price it in a way that makes the canal a true revenue generator, right? And that's going to have an impact on what makes it easier to use the canal versus other alternatives. That's going to play a big role. So pricing strategies on the canal side, pricing strategies for intermodal rail from both the West Coast and the East Coast for goods moving to the heart of the country. Everyone says where the battle is occurring, right? We're fighting with the East Coast over the heartland of America. And I think that's what he's getting at when he's talking about some of the imperfect information, things we just don't know yet. And the Canal Authority is going to be responsive to changing economic conditions and the same things that industry as a whole is going to be looking at.
And I'm sure we're going to get into a lot of that in just a few moments with our special guest today, Joey Carnes. But Tom, we're going to say goodbye to you for the moment, although you're really not going anywhere. No. Tom has a laptop computer on the table right next to him, and he's going to be using that to monitor the chat questions and comments that you may be sending in to us. With any luck, you have a chat window open as you're looking at live stream right now on the CITT Net channel that we have created. And Tom is going to go through those. It's unlikely that we're going to be able to get to every question, but we do encourage you to go ahead and use that chat capability. That's how we're going to be able to interact with you. And he will pull some of those off, and we'll be getting to that after I spend a little bit of time talking to our guest today. So, Tom, we'll check back with you in a few minutes.
It's a little bit like election night or something.
It does, isn't it? It's live. It certainly is. Like I said, we're going to turn over. I'm going to go to the other side here now and just say that we are incredibly fortunate to have terrific guests lined up for each of these programs. We're going to start with Joey Carnes. Joey is Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of MIQ Logistics. MIQ is a $500 million global logistics company with offices throughout the U.S. and the rest of the world. Before he got to MIQ, he was with Bax Global Incorporated, a $3 billion global supply chain company. He started his career 35 years ago with the U.S. Customs Service. Over the years, he has built a supply chain library. The bio I saw said 800 books. He corrected that and said it's really more like 1,200 today if you don't count the repeats, the ones he's got more than one copy of. He's flown in from corporate headquarters in Overland Park, Kansas, just to be with us on the program today. So, Joey, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
MIQ Logistics is one of those companies that is frequently referred to as a 3PL. Could you remind us what that means?
Well, a 3PL is a service organization that has the ability to assist a company in how it drives, leads, or organizes a supply chain. So through the different nodes of service, be it air, ocean, or ground, through any origin-destination pair through that matrix. So a 3PL organization has a wherewithal, or should have the wherewithal, to provide the service or identify which service should be used to help an importer or exporter understand how to best arrive at the best decision or optimizing their supply chain movement.
And these advantages that you bring to your clients, I mean, you find the clients themselves often don't have the level of expertise that a 3PL may be able to bring to the table.
Well, as Tom said, it's a very dynamic process, and it's evolving, it's changing dramatically. If you look at where it was 5 years ago versus where it is today, with the advent of new technology, different origin-destination pairs as a result of sourcing where goods are coming from, for any individual company to be on top of that activity with command of a great staff to be able to do it. And then you also have the luxury, if you will, of having dealt with so many different companies that are trying to achieve so many different objectives, that it gives you a little more flexibility in the response relative to what the options are. And that's invaluable in this economy.
Seems like an awful lot of variables to try and keep track of.
Well, you go through a decision tree. A particular customer has to make a lot of decisions of what they're going to do in order to move their traffic. So they're looking for trust and expertise in a particular decision tree that they require.
Maybe we'll get a little further into that decision tree and the kinds of decisions that are things that have to be taken into account as they make that decision. But, you know, you're in Kansas. Tom was talking about the heartland. That's what we are going to be battling for. I hate to use these wartime appropriate metaphors. Should we expect, therefore, since you're pretty much in the exact middle of the continental U.S., that you are absolutely nonpartisan when it comes to East versus West Coast?
Oh, total neutrality. Yeah. Total, absolutely. But I do have an opinion.
Oh, good. That's why you're here.
There you go. That's right.
Let me give you a hypothetical.
All right.
I had a major retailer, and I've got a boatload, if you'll pardon the expression, of flat-screen TVs that I need to get to my Chicago area warehouses and stores by November, not surprisingly. What would you tell me, I've come to you as a new client, about that challenge? And is what you're going to tell me going to change at all after 2014 and that new wider ditch?
Very well could be. I think the jury's still out until we identify what it's going to mean. But certainly in 2014, the expectation there are going to be more options available. But if I were advising you today, I'd have to ask you some questions about the origin of the freight, and then based on the origin, say, India west or east will determine your shipping pattern, if you're going to move it through the East Coast or West Coast. Then I'm going to ask you the question of how fast do you need it? So the speed of which your decision needs to take place is a big part of that. And then the next biggest question is going to be, what is your infrastructure you're trying to move it through? So do you have DCs? Have you created infrastructure that you're having to process the freight through that drives part of that decision as well? Those are major components.
Clearly, one size doesn't fit all. The right solution for one company, not necessarily correct even for their competitor?
Oh, absolutely. Because of that infrastructure they build, you can take two retailers and they do it totally differently, but they achieve the same objective. So you've got to understand what their dynamics are in order to help them choose the right infrastructure that exists in the supply chain itself. Because if you're trying to do a one-size-fits-all, everybody's going to be competing for the same vessel or the same intermodal solution or the same truck line. So you have to better understand the dynamics of their own infrastructure before you can help make that decision.
You have got to be thinking about what's going to happen when the new and improved canal opens in 2014. How is that going to change the game, in your opinion?
Well, I think there are two primary things to consider. One is if we have an economy that rebounds like it was doing many years ago before we hit the recession, the ports were already challenged with the throughput of volume. So that's what caused the cooperation that's taking place here in LA and Long Beach now, trying to do things more efficiency and free productivity, because the volume projections were so high that it was challenging the infrastructure that already existed. If the expanded capability of the canal is such that you get larger vessels coming through, the ones that are coming out of production now, the new large round-the-world vessels, is going to have so much more capacity, it is going to give the retailer or the importer more choices of what options to use. Again, based on the intermodal connectivity, which is a big advantage of LA and Long Beach currently. They have so many connectivities into the Chicago areas where roughly 50% of that cargo goes now at some inland point. So the canal is just going to provide, hopefully, the expectation is anyway, more options for them to consider. And hopefully, if we get the volume that we're expecting, alleviate some of that congestion that was going to exist anyway.
Tom would be able to tell us, and maybe we'll get back to this when he comes back into the conversation, that the experts who participated in the event last October took, in some cases, almost polar opposite positions, that West Coast ports are fine, they're always going to be at the other end of that straight line from Asia, they're going to be just perfectly okay, and others who said, no, we have to take certain measures to make sure that we remain competitive. Not just with the East Coast, but with all the other ports that I know you've talked about as well.
Well, you're absolutely right. That competitive thread has got to be a key component, because when any importer I've talked to recently in preparation for this event, I actually went out and updated my information to make sure it was correct, and it validates what Tom just said. The decision tree an importer or exporter is going to go through is they're going to say, what is the speed of execution I can rely on? What is the consistency that's there?
So that's the Tom referred to as reliability, consistency, same thing.
Well, it's predictability. That's what they're after. They're trying to predict, because there's no inventory in the supply chain anymore. So these decision trees have to really predict deliverables on an outcome that has a range of accuracy that it just has to happen. And then it comes back to the cost. So what the canal is going to do is really beg the question for particularly LA of the competitiveness of the cost. The other advantage, though, is going to be the infrastructure that already exists here, which is very powerful in that decision process. But then the outside influences that come into play, like the environmental controls, the accessorial fees, all of the nuances or nuisance items that come into play, depending how you want to look at them, that affect that decision and the outcome.
Is a canal, a wider canal, going to lift all boats?
I think the jury's still out on that. The hope is it's just going to give more choices and allow these larger vessels with more capacity to be able to move faster and to be able to make a more predictable supply chain. So the expectation is it's going to have an impact, a positive impact. I think it remains to be seen what the outcome is, as Tom mentioned as well. It's going to be who's going to win the race to the middle of, well, heart of America. You know, that's the debate, and that remains to be seen. And I think all these outside influences as far as sourcing changes that are going to take place that determine the origin of the cargo in the first place, the environmental influences, the cost of fuel. So you have a lot of outside factors that have yet to be determined.
So just as we saw in the article that I mentioned, a lot of people having to make decisions now based on incomplete information.
Well, they are, and that's a big factor as well, is that it goes back to that predictability. An importer needs to have predictability, but he also has to have contingency plans. So a part of the canal or part of the service that's provided is what happens when you have an event that disrupts the supply chain and they have to fall back to some contingency planning. No one wants to do it, but you have to explore, you have to use the services, you have to have the ability to see, can you move your cargo in that environment as a contingency planning. So you'll see part of that in the decision process as the canal opens as well.
Yeah, those events, the first thing that occurs to me, of course, is the active nature that has disrupted things, trade across the Pacific, the tsunami. Is that the kind of thing you're talking about?
Absolutely. The tsunami, the natural disasters, the volcanoes that happened, you know, in Europe, anything that causes the disruption of that flow, an importer has to make a decision, or what are my options in the event that happens. So the canal will certainly play a part of that decision.
I'm going to turn to the fourth factor that you've talked about sometimes, infrastructure, which, you know, there's an port in the world, I'm sure, that doesn't see need for improving its infrastructure, but you see those improvements happening in some places more than others. You've given the example of Canadian railroads that are putting a lot of money into this.
Well, all the railroads are. CSX, you look at any of the railroads that are building these intermodal routes across the U.S. or from origin-destination pairs, everyone is expecting, you know, the canal to have an effect, and so you can see the investments that are being made. But the infrastructure is a big deal because that congestion has to be relieved. So you have to match that asset with the flow of cargo, and that's a dynamic event even up today. A lot of the footwear origins moving from, say, you know, in China over to Vietnam. So shifts of that nature change where the equipment's placed, changes everything.
Could you see, I'm going to go back to that example I gave of one size does not fit all, where in this new era, the 2014 and on era, where two companies that are very similar, one might find that having its cargo head for a Gulf or East Coast port is best for it, but another direct competitor might stick with the West Coast, and they might both do very well.
Well, a lot of that decision is going to be determined by what cycle the company is in. When we look at companies, we try to identify, are they in a growth cycle, a mature cycle, challenge cycle? That's the polite word. They're really in a troubled cycle. So in the first sense, a company in the growth cycle is after speed, and that's going to be their decision in that process. If they're on a commanding market share, then they're after the consistency, and that's going to be the driver of a lot of their decisions. But if in the troubled cycle, it's going to be purely on cost. I
remember you gave as one of those companies that's pretty stable and is looking for that consistency is some place like the Gap.
Absolutely. They're one of the companies I contacted because they look at same-store sales, they look at what their growth in the Gap stores is going to be and the location, and that's what drives their decision process, because they're after consistency where they have commanding market share, but where they are gaining market share and have growth, then they're going to go for the speed. And so in their decision process as it relates to their supply chain, those will be the factors that drive the decision or the outcome.
The companies that come to you, they probably have a pretty good idea of what they think they want. Is that always what they really need or maybe want? Maybe there are other things you have to dig up?
Is this being recorded?
No, of course not.
Of course not. Well, the challenge there is that, you know, companies are, well, I'll put it in these terms. This position is probably the most challenging position, because this position, meaning the head of an organization, is sending messages to a company that says to sales, sell. It's telling the CFO not to spend any money, and it's telling operations not to miss a delivery. So when you send that into the channels of the company, you have to be very careful, because when they collide together, you have conflict. So what we have to deal with is understanding where the demand signal is, what the person in procurement, for example, has heard versus what they're trying to achieve. So to answer your question, no. What they're initially looking for many times is not really what they need. So you have to dig a little bit deeper and ask more questions, so that you're not in a dichotomy of a company and your solution will not meet what the direction of the company needs to be, as opposed to just giving you what they ask for.
Interesting. And this is something that you see pretty consistently?
Daily.
Helping companies out. Yeah, well,
Yes.
it's part of the service, I suppose.
Yeah.
With apologies to our friends who may be watching on the East Coast, this is a West Coast-based program. And as someone who has to deal with these factors all the time, can you talk a little bit about the things that you would most like to see happen out of, we'll say specifically, LA and Long Beach, to help us help ourselves? I mean, to make us stay as competitive as possible.
Well, it's encouraging. I think the decline in activity, or the recession, if you put it in those terms, has caused the collaboration. The word supply chain in and of itself connotates the collaboration that needs to exist, and I think we see that starting to happen. And we're starting to see barriers come down between groups that have to work together to get the productivity and the efficiency higher than where it is in the port of LA and Long Beach. And we're seeing that happening now. We're also seeing the investments and things that are necessary as far as the new technology and infrastructure of the port itself to be more competitive. So it lags in the competitiveness when you compare it to the productivity of other ports. But I think that you see a willingness now for the bodies to come together and start taking away those barriers. The threat is, though, of the environmental fees that will come into play. So I think what the port here has to guard against is adding all the accessorial and nuisance fees that are going to come into play if they're not careful.
Where do you look to find ports that seem to be doing it right, really doing a great job of improving their competitiveness?
Well, I'd prefer to get the feedback of the importers I've talked to in preparation for this event, and the comments they've given back to me is that they like to use LA Long Beach because of the critical mass that's available here, its connectivity to the intermodal. It just has volume and skill sets that are hard to replicate.
I think, speaking of volume, the warehousing capacity that we have in this area that you certainly don't see at every port around the country.
Oh, it's huge. It's significant. And if the volumes continue to come back, the ability to move it north to Tacoma or one of the other areas, they just do not have the size or skill that is located here. So when we start looking at identifying a solution, you're gravitating back to where you have critical mass and that dependability, but it just has to work. So what you're really asking for is LA and Long Beach to come together with the associations and the people that make the containers move smoothly in and out of the facility to continue that progress that they're making.
Okay. I just have maybe one other question, but I do want to remind our viewers that we are getting very close now to when we're going to open this up and start taking your questions. Once again, you can send those to us via the chat window that should be open in your live stream player right now on the CITT Net channel. You are watching the first in our special series of new webcasts from the Center for International Trade and Transportation, and we are coming to you from California State University, Long Beach. My guest on this side is Joey Carnes of MIQ Logistics, and we'll be bringing Tom O'Brien of the CITT back into the conversation in just a minute. If I can ask you to go out on a limb, because it's hard to make predictions, especially about the future, as Yogi Berra, I think, said. What do you see over the next 5 years? We're only roughly 3 years out now from the opening of the canal, but there are so many other factors, like the appearance before too long of those new gargantuan ships, which once again will be beyond what the canal can handle.
Well, it begs those questions. It begs the questions of what is going to be the ability for these ports to handle, that additional volume and capacity with the new cranes. I think the investments are being made to anticipate those. I would beg another question that's kind of outside of that realm, though, the question of demographics, of the aging population. And if we are truly a consumer economy, I'd like to see actuaries being brought into the picture. They do a good job of predicting, life expectancies. And something I'm very interested in right now is what the demographics look like. In 2012, our population has moved from 10% of the population being 50 and over to 30% being 50 and over. So if you're in the supply chain, you're putting up distribution centers, or you're trying to predict and forecast your investment, for capacity, where are you going to put it? Where's that audience going to be? What are their buying patterns? It certainly would seem to suggest those are going to shift.
Yeah.
So.
And I know that this is something, it might not be the first thing that you would say, oh, this is the kind of thing that a 3PL provider is going to be paying attention to, but you really see this as key to the future.
Well, I do. When you look at the cold chain requirements, for healthcare companies, if you look at that space and just anticipate, if you have a growing population that's going to be significant, and that the consumer spending and that particular need, what happens to the cold chain requirements? Do you have that capacity that's being thought about today and all of the developments you're referring to? For all the changes LA Long Beach is going to put into place, or any other port for that matter, are you putting that factor into your algorithm to say, I need to be considerate of it? Because if you're not, I think that you're going to wake up 4 or 5 years down the road, have a significant shift, and not be prepared for it. And I think it's a real issue.
Fascinating. All right, I'm going to say that it's time for us to go back over to Tom, who has been taking notes as we've been speaking, and we will open this up now for the chat conversation. And I'm going to say that we have about 25 minutes left, so we've got quite a bit of time. If you've been holding off, or if anything from the conversation has stimulated your mind, get to your keyboard and drop us a line via that chat window that you see in the live stream channel. And I hope that we've seen things starting to come in. Have we, Tom?
We're starting to. People have been quiet, but I think that's because the discussion was so interesting.
Well, good. I hope so.
But we do have a question that actually builds upon, Joey, what you were actually ending with, and that's about the planning process. And the question comes from Steve: with variables in flux, do shippers plan and strategize the way they used to? Or have you actually changed the way you take in the information and do forecasting and that sort of thing? And then the second question is, what does all this mean for port investment?
Well, I'd say the decision process has gotten a lot better just at the advent of technology. But that has changed too. It had a bit of a snag hit because you were able to analyze historical data, and then you would make decisions in your supply chain accordingly based on seasonality. You would base it on access as far as carriers, where the carriers had assets in play. But these disruptions we talked about earlier have changed that dynamic dramatically. No one planned on the tsunami. No one planned on the volcano. No one planned on the recession to be as hard and long as it was, a 40% drop in some of the activity. And when you put the dynamics of that in play, same-store sales going down, the process right now is a lot more challenging because it doesn't have the predictability in their own forecasting. So it ripples through the whole supply chain relative to what do I do? Do I anticipate sales and go ahead and make those orders? Do I put it on a slow carrier, only have volume demands pick up? So the dynamics relative to what went into that algorithm of decision have been so impacted by outside factors, fuel being one of them. If fuel were to continue on the trajectory it was headed, it would drive decisions to bring sourcing back closer to the U.S., change the whole dynamic of the supply chain. So right now, the flexibility is the key. It's taking the most relevant information that you have available to you, and you don't spin the crystal ball, but you really have to step back and make some challenging decisions relative to what's my best estimate of what's going to happen over a quarter. It's very difficult to plan forward-looking now when you had historical data that gave you seasonality that you were able to stay in lockstep with.
The secondary question was about port investment, and I know that's you don't make those decisions, but I'll maybe ask it another way. That one of the things that was raised in Bill Mongaluzzo's piece that you referred to, Matt, was that railroads, ports in this country are actually investing more than the total sum to improve the Panama Canal to get ready for the opportunities that the canal is going to bring. So I guess I would ask, what does the current state of the economy, change in fuel prices, as well as the opportunities that are being brought about by the Panama Canal, what does it suggest about where we should be prioritizing investments in this country? Is the Heartland Corridor, is that the significant thing we should be looking at, or is it something else on the West Coast? Where would you like to see the investment dollars go?
Well, I like them where they're going because I think the railroad investments that they're making is improving the infrastructure, and the effectiveness now of intermodal to move cargo is very effective. And with the road congestion that we have and the new carrier rules that are going out with DOT as far as the number of drive hours that a driver can make, again, the demographics are playing a role in it. The average age of a driver in a semi now is aging. So the ability to attract new players into that space is a challenge the carriers are having. So I like what I see relative to the investment in the port structure of making it more efficient to get the throughput higher. I personally endorse and like the intermodal advances that are being made. So I think that, based on my 2 cents, we're moving in the right direction.
I wonder if, a tangible, again, I hate to call it something like a threat, but we'll call it that, a tangible threat like the expansion of the canal isn't just providing incentive to facilities all over this country and beyond to do things that are obviously in their interest even if the canal wasn't being widened.
I think that's true. I think that there's a need, and there's been a need, but there hasn't been the appetite to do it. So this, I think you're right, as a catalyst, as a reason of anticipation, or whatever the catalyst needed to be, these investments needed to be made anyway. So I would agree with you. I think that for whatever reason, if this served as a catalyst, it's been helpful.
Tom, what else have you got?
We have a question about regulations that vary from state to state. The questioner asks or states, some states have more permissive regulations than others when it comes to allowing trucks to carry fully loaded ISO containers. Can you comment on the effects of these regulations on port choices?
I think of the environmental regulations that you started to address earlier, too.
Well, there's, again, a host of factors that go into that. Again, part of the decision is that these are just things a lot of importers have to deal with because they're trying to meet store sales in a particular region. So they're forced to. They don't have a choice. So they deal with these regulations, but they really complain about them because they're a nuisance in a lot of cases, or they're just problematic. Or they cause delays, tolls at bridges where you can't get past, quickly. Or you look at the Mexican border, trying to come across the Mexican border and the regulations that come into play there. And there's a big debate that's happening now. Do you let Mexican carriers that do not pass DOT requirements and all come into the U.S.? Should they be a victim of those? So there are trade-offs. I would argue they should meet the DOT requirements. You don't want the unsafe vehicle in the U.S. So when you start looking at the dynamics of where the cargo needs to go, does the importer have a choice? In most cases, they do not. So they have to live with these regulations, but it comes back to the global competitiveness now. I think it's a higher arching question. If the U.S. is truly going to be competitive, it can't cause itself to be less than competitive because of barriers it puts up in these intermodal or truck moving lane pairs.
You're watching Cargo and Jobs from the Center for International Trade and Transportation at California State University, Long Beach. And I'm Matt Kaplan. My guests are Joy Carnes of MIQ Logistics, and on this side, Tom O'Brien, my colleague in the Center for International Trade and Transportation. And we are taking questions now. Tom is keeping an eye on the chat window over there, and we're going to keep going to that as well. If you'd like to get your thoughts in, please go ahead and type those in. But I also want to ask those of you who are here in our studio audience, I think we can say, if you have a question, please feel free to come on up to our Q&A microphone there, and we will be happy to hear from you as well. Tom, how's the chat window going?
It's good. We're starting to heat up. I have a question from Manitoba, so I think we've successfully broadened our audience. And the question is this, is the Port of Prince Rupert a legitimate option as a West Coast port, and how might the Panama Canal expansion affect its operation?
Good question. Again, I just look at the capability it has as far as throughput. The idea becomes, as we get the volumes back to the West Coast, if the economy does continue to rise, you're going to look at relief, particularly in seasonal times of the year, and that's what happens to cargo, is pushed north, and those ports are considered considerations for that relief based when they see congestion. So I don't know how much throughput that port really offers. Any development of a port, though, I would say, either on the Gulf Coast or northwest, northeast, any development of a port and increase in capacity is helpful to our economy.
So it's part of a four-corner strategy.
Absolutely.
Whether the Panama Canal expands or not.
Absolutely. It's necessary, and if it's a catalyst, like you were saying earlier, I think it should happen.
We have a question actually that I wrote down while we were talking, but this is from Gil. Do you think transloading from 20s and 40s to 53-foot containers will continue to grow as a share of total imports?
I do, but it comes back to the cost model. When you look at the studies that take place, again, with a importer's own infrastructure and what they're trying to do as far as bypass DCs in some cases, I think transload is a trade-off. There's a trade-off in that the transportation cost is up, but the speed is faster in many cases because they're able to bypass their own infrastructure or bypass bottlenecks within their own structure. So I think transload will continue because it gives speed. It's a little higher cost in some cases than running it through their own distribution center, but it's more effective. It's both efficient and effective if it's predictable where you're needing that cargo to be. If you're having to stop and sort that cargo because you don't know destination, it's better to put it in your own distribution facility. So again, that decision tree and the cost model is what's going to drive that decision.
And from an infrastructure perspective, the perception is that the West Coast and the Southwest in particular is well positioned because of our transloading capacity. Do you see that as a need on the East Coast?
Not only do I see it as a need, I see a lot of cost, or not cost, I see a lot of investment in that area. If you just go to the Port of Savannah, for example, you look at the trade zones that are being developed there. They've cleared large pieces of property, and they're on the ready now for that build-up. So I think that we will continue to see that infrastructure investment in these areas. But you've got to go a long way to catch up with LA has. You know, LA Long Beach, just the critical mass size combined, they're what, the 5th busiest port in the world. You know, it's a pretty big
6th,
number.
I think, actually. Is
6th?
the most,
Yeah.
But busiest in the U.S.
Right.
So.
Absolutely.
And I was going to ask about that as well. These East Coast ports and Gulf ports that we're hearing are making these investments in infrastructure. But Tom, I know this may be more a question for you. Is it paying off for them already? And actually, Joey, if you want to jump in as well. I mean, I remember something about Norfolk making some investments, and some retailers putting a lot of hope into that, and maybe it didn't work out has not yet at least worked out as well as they were hoping.
I think there's probably mixed reviews on that. I know that several large importers have worked very hard with different ports of call. If you take Walmart, for example, they had a partnership arrangement with Norfolk many years ago where they went in and basically gave them a forecast and a commitment of what they would do, which gave them the ability to invest in the infrastructure in Norfolk. So I think that still happens today with a lot of large users, who have a lot of TEUs. They work very hard to partner with these ports to commit volumes so that they do have a better projection of what they can count on. So I think it is working. I think when the recession hit, though, and the volumes dropped precipitously, it just rearranges the equation. So I think that's what we're faced with, while you get mixed reactions. Is it working or not working? As long as everything's on a trajectory that's positive, things are going well.
And you're optimistic. Obviously, things are turning up.
Well, I'm optimistic from the standpoint that we spent the last 5 years chasing bottom. Our industry is kind of a bellwether of the economy. You can kind of tell if cargo volumes are moving or going up and down. And every year we thought we'd hit bottom. We were always forecasting that we think this is it. And it had a precipitous slide for 4 or 5 years in all modes: truck, ground, big ocean, air. And you see the impact of the decisions that were made in the assets with carriers, where they placed the assets. based on what we're seeing today, what we're cautiously optimistic is the favorite term, is that we did hit bottom in '09. We have seen an uptick in 10, as you've seen by the volumes in LA, Long Beach that are projected from '09 to '10 to '11. So those increases would seem to indicate or suggest, absent some other natural disaster or some economic decline in banking or something that would have a dramatic impact, we believe that the industry has hit bottom, and we know there's a lot of money on the sidelines looking for a place to go. So we're optimistic that 11 is going to be better than 10, and that's a big thing to say given the last 5 years.
Barring those unforeseen circumstances.
Yes, barring those unforeseen circumstances. Yeah.
We've got a couple of questions. One is about retiring the debt service on the canal expansion. We won't ask you to predict what the Canal Authority is going to do, but we talked in the introduction about this revenue versus volume. Do you have any predictions about what pricing might be like based on recent patterns?
I do not. I'm not knowledgeable enough to comment. You can go a couple of different directions, the political influences versus the trade influences on that, and I think it's too early to tell.
You have to think the government is going to be under enormous pressure internally to make back that $5 billion.
You would certainly think that, and the trade can apply a lot of pressure. If it's applied to the government entities in the right manner, the right things happen. If it's not subject to listening to those pressures, then, it's anybody's guess. So,
got another one for us there?
We do. But another question on the environmental regulatory side. And the question is whether the new environmental regulations in California, specifically mandating truckers to purchase new equipment, has impacted the decisions by beneficial cargo owners, BCOs, to change or look for alternative routes to ship other than LA Long Beach.
I don't think it has, because I think that, again, they're so locked into their own infrastructure relative to where they need to cargo to move. I think they're trying to figure out how to deal with it, because the pressure on a carrier today to update their equipment or to deal with the new driving rules is creating a problem. All right, hours of service of a driver, and we're trying to figure out what problem did it solve. So the biggest question that's out there is what was the driving force that caused this to happen? And it wasn't an accident rate, as we believe was part of the argument. So there's not enough credible evidence to suggest, other than the environmental impact possibly, but it's going to put more trucks on the road, so it kind of defeats that purpose. So there's some debate of which, you can take either side. The reality, though, is that the equipment's getting old. The age of the equipment on the roads now, because of companies' inability or not wanting to invest in additional capital. Average life of a trailer now, which is life expectancy is about 8 years, is quickly approaching that. Same in the life of a tractor. So if you put all of that in the mix, there's some good things that come out of it. If you look to Wabash's, who's a container manufacturer, numbers, they're gearing up, hiring back, putting a lot of confidence in the fact there's going to be a lot more purchases of trailers, which is helpful to the economy. So again, that's kind of a mixed issue in my mind. I think it is for a lot of people.
Are you seeing the environmental regulatory pressures that we've been familiar with in California for a number of years now moving to the Gulf and East Coast? I mean, it's sort of been a perception that it's increased the cost of doing business here, but...
Can I plead the fifth? Or?
Yeah.
Because you'd like to say that it's kind of like the Panama Canal. I think you have certain areas of the country that are more trade sensitive than California is. California is a bit of a different entity when it comes to how they believe the world should respond or react. And so I think they are more disciplined in imposing restrictions. And if they, in fact, restrict trade, you're supposed to understand that it's better for you. Whereas other parts like Texas or the East Coast, I think will be a little more deliberate in the decision of how it impacts trade and will be guided accordingly. Was that politically correct enough?
Yeah. Okay. Impressive.
So
well done. Well done.
All right, thank you.
While we're waiting for another one to come in, I have another question. We've been talking about competitiveness in the context of East Coast versus West Coast versus Gulf, but you did talk about U.S. national competitiveness. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about what could be done from a policy perspective at the national level, whether it's an infrastructure bank or a freight trust fund or something that would put us in the best position to compete for increased cargo volumes coming out of Asia.
Before you answer that, can I just mention that this loaded question for Tom, because one of his regular themes in his writing is the lack of, or at least the lack of, an adequate national transportation policy in this country.
Freight policy. We have a transportation policy
right.
that's often at odds with our trade policy, I think.
Well, the way I'd like to respond to that is I'm kind of a fact-driven person. You know, I think that you kind of, if you were trying to solve any other problem, if your son or daughter had a health issue, you would pull together the doctors that have the best ability, that know how to communicate a solution. In our environment, from the government agencies, typically the people that are engaged with having that responsibility, it's just not that segment of people. When I look at Congress and the people and the comments that are made, it begs the question that they're almost out of touch with the entity that should be making that decision. So my response is, I would argue, become a very big proponent of, is that do the same thing you would do if you were solving a problem in a health care issue, with your child. Bring the best, the brightest, and listen to them, and not let it get stuck in a quagmire of political correctness or political mumbo-jumbo, because that's where we find ourselves. And that's why solutions are not even talked about. It's the noise that takes place.
We have only about 5 minutes left today in this first episode, actually, in what will be a 3-part series of webcasts or webinars that, as you know, we're calling Cargo and Jobs, Still Ours to Lose. If you still have a couple of minutes, if you want to get in on the chat window there and get your question or comment up in front of Tom, and he will relay it to us. We'll tell you a little bit more about what's coming up in just a minute or two as I close out today's program, and we're going to finish at the top of the hour. Tom?
We do. This goes back to the emphasis that Joey's placed on predictability. The question is, are the predictable models that forecast the shift of cargo from one port to another, one in particular, LA Long Beach? And if so, what are they saying?
Good question.
Well, I mean, I think that just begs the question. There are modeling tools out there now that are very good, and they're very robust, and any importer with any volume is using that tool. But it's based on history and it's based on need. So it is still influenced by the characteristics of the cargo you're trying to move. And go back to the 3 things you started the program off with. Do you need speed, do you need consistency, or is it cost? And then the 4th factor you put in there is that, do I need to utilize my own capacity, in my infrastructure? So you can't get away from the 4 key elements of that algorithm. So the modeling is certainly there, the technology is there, it's very intelligent, it's very robust, it's very quick. And then you apply that to the industry of what's changed when you run the model of what's available. So the Panama Canal will be a new factor in that as an option that didn't exist. So if you can appreciate the fact that the algorithm is still the same algorithm, but the dynamics...
The inputs.
Exactly.
Tom, can I ask you, I mean, you had this tripod of speed, reliability, and price. How do you feel about this addition of that 4th leg of the table, infrastructure?
Good. You want good information as part of your model. So in that sense, you just want to, whatever the factors are that people are using to base their decisions on, you want to be part of that model itself. Good models are difficult often to. Even if you've got it, you've got to make sure that you know how to analyze the data that's coming out of it.
Very good point.
I think we have time for maybe one more.
Yeah. So we'll take this last question. Question about impact of decisions made in China on what we do here in the U.S. About China encouraging Mexico to invest in port and rail facilities, and the potential impact on LA Long Beach. I would add to that, I know that there's been some talk about China investing in the construction of a dry canal across Colombia that would be an alternative to the Panama Canal. So I guess the question is what about decisions being made in China impacting our decision making here?
Well, this will be an off-the-cuff comment, because I think, again, that anything that's going to allow production to come closer to the U.S. And develop this matrix of transportation decisions is good. But when you come into Mexico, you've got to put the whole political element and security into play. Many companies have tried to establish beachheads in Mexico, and the political environment, the unrest, the safety, trump a lot of these decisions. So I think the first thing that, if I were going to be making an investment in Mexico, I'm going to want to see some stability in that side of the equation, because we've seen many large companies go in, make a very concerted effort, and have to pull out because of those factors. Because bear in mind, it's so close, you would think it would trump decisions just based on the transportation costs and the closeness to the U.S. and the labor that's available. But when you get into all of the other political, quote, issues, it would beg the question, is that influence of any value at this stage?
Gentlemen, we'll have to leave it at that. Did you have a last comment?
There's a
Tom?
last question
Sure.
for you, Matt. Is the webinar going to be posted on the CITT
Absolutely.
website?
It is, I'm sorry, Joey, it is being recorded, and we are going to make it available on the CITT website for on-demand viewing, and we certainly hope that you will share that information with your colleagues if you've enjoyed the program today. We have to leave it at that, I'm afraid, for this one around. Joey, thanks very much for your participation and great insights.
Thanks for having me.
Joey Carnes is Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of MIQ Logistics, a $500 million global logistics company with offices pretty much everywhere on the planet, actually. That's it for this first installment of our series, Cargo and Jobs, Still Ours to Lose. We'll be back in 2 weeks on June 3rd, once again from noon to 1 Pacific time. We'll talk about whether Southern California is competitive, something that's come up today, but we can get into more detail then. If it is competitive, how do we keep it that way? And we'll be joined by Fran Inman of Majestic Realty Company, and she is a member of the California Transportation Commission. Our third and final webcast is set for 4 weeks from today. That'll be Friday, June 17, again at noon. And John McLaren of the Pacific Merchant Shipping Association will be here, along with the guy who's retiring soon, Richard Steinke, Dick Steinke, the Executive Director of the Port of Long Beach, will join us for that program. They'll help us examine the challenges that lie ahead of us. I also want to thank our sponsors once again. They are the Port of Long Beach, the Port of Los Angeles, the International Longshore and Warehouse Union, and the Metrans Transportation Center. There are some individuals you should also know something about. Alex Traver is here and helped to set all this up, got us this nice drape that you see behind us, and is taking care of a lot of the other logistics, that word once again. So Alex, thank you for your help. She is with the Center for International Trade and Transportation. Over there pushing the buttons and keeping an eye on the sound and picture is Vic Carpenter from the Advanced Media Production Center here at Cal State Long Beach. I am personally quite indebted to Tom O'Brien, the man on my right, for his ongoing guidance and advice, and that's something we'll be able to get his participation from in the next programs as well. And then there's the woman who makes it all happen in this area around here, and that is CITT Executive Director Marianne Veneris, who couldn't be with us today. She's out there on the road, but Marianne, you're the best. Cargo and Jobs, Still Ours to Lose is a production of the Center for International Trade and Transportation, a division of the College of Continuing and Professional Education here at California State University, Long Beach. Our executive producer is Associate Vice President and Dean, Dr. Jeet Joshi, and we hope we'll see you again in 2 weeks.